I can see everything.
Okay.
Okay. Well, hi, everybody. Thank you for coming. My name is Marybeth Hanley, and I'm going to give a presentation that I hope you'll enjoy called Ecological Landscaping with Native Plants. And just a little, I guess I'll introduce myself here. I've been working as a botanist in New England for the last several years, mainly in conservation involving rare plants and also invasive plants and native plant communities. I earned my master's degree in biological sciences and botany from the University of Rhode Island in 2006. And since then, I've been working for a number of federal and state agencies, including the Park Service, the Forest Service right now, environmental consulting groups, land trusts. And most recently, I've been working as a seasonal botanist for the Forest Service Green Mountain and Finger Lakes National Forest. So I'm going to have a lot of pictures from the Finger Lakes that I hope you'll enjoy. And I'm also working with the land trust here as a consulting botanist and the coordinator of something called the Cooperative Reed Management Program, where we try to reach out to the public and educate people and get people involved in managing invasive plants on their properties. Because, you know, the reality is that we manage them on public lands, but they're not just on public lands, they're every place. So, a quick housekeeping note, just feel free to type in questions via the chat function, and then I will answer them at the end of the presentation. Thank you. Okay, so just like generally, like when we're talking about the concept of ecological landscaping, it really has to do with thinking about, like, you know, your home and your landscape within the larger ecosystem that we live in. And then in a practical way, engaging in landscape behaviors, practices that promote natural biodiversity of animals, attract pollinators, removing invasive species, introducing native species, things like reducing fertilizer runoff if you live on a wetland. So what I want to do here is I'm going to talk about 4 major topics that have to do with ecological landscaping with native plants. So I'm going to start with non-native invasive plants, which will be timely since I realize that this is the Invasive Species Awareness Week in the Finger Lakes. And then I'm going to try to kind of explain some practical steps and give you examples with resources as to how you would go about doing this in your own private landscape, like removing the invasives, evaluating the conditions of your landscape, introducing native plants, including ones that are attractive to pollinators and wildlife. And then the last thing I'll talk about is kind of the aesthetics of blending ornamental and native plants together in the home landscape. So, the first topic I'm going to talk about is non-native invasive plants. Now, these pictures here are all from the Finger Lakes on the bottom. I don't know if you can tell what they are, but you got a bush honeysuckle here on the left, and then there's multiflora rose and garlic mustard. What is a non-native invasive plant? You know, when Hillary and I started, we were talking about just invasive plants in general, and you know, there's so many of them, and they're in a lot of different places in North America, and you think that people have been studying them for years, but really it hasn't been that long that people have been looking at these things. It's sort of like just started around the time that I started working as a botanist. So it was sort of like the, 80s, 90s. When I did the first survey that I did for a job that I did for the National Park Service, nobody had done a an invasive plant survey. So we didn't really know, we kind of knew just from looking what things were invasive, but when we did the survey, we just looked at what's exotic, not necessarily what's invasive, and then evaluated the invasibility of it. So, but when you talk about a plant that's non-native and invasive, it just means it's not native to the area that you're in, and then they grow in an invasive manner that's detrimental to the environment. And, you know, there's a lot of exotic plants, there's a lot of non-native plants, some of which have become naturalized, meaning they live wild in the region they're not native to, but they're not invasive. So just because a plant is non-native doesn't mean that it's invasive. And people didn't know that this was going to happen when they introduced these plants. But why do we care? We care because these invasions are very detrimental to nature in a number of different ways. One of the most obvious ways is, you know, invasive plants will form monocultures. They'll outcompete native plants. So they're completely changing the landscape. They can also cause large-scale environmental problems like flooding and erosion. And this other example that I have here, sometimes there are indirect or direct and indirect effects of these invasive plants. Sometimes, you know, it might be, in the case of this rare West Virginia butterfly, the butterfly actually mistakes an invasive plant for its host plant, because garlic mustard looks very similar to the toothwort plant, and it lays its larvae on garlic mustard, and the caterpillars die. So it can also affect the life cycle of animals as well. So with invasive plants, there's so many different growth forms. You know, there are a number of herbs, there are shrubs, there are subshrubs, trees, vines, and they flower and fruit at different times. They have different ecological consequences, and then so there are different ways of managing them. So you kind of have to look at the species and evaluate the situation. Unfortunately, there's not like an answer that's similar to all of them. You sort of have to take them individually. So in terms of identification, I'm going to go over, like, you know, about a dozen of the major offenders in the Finger Lakes, and show you some pictures of some of these infestations that I've worked in the Finger Lakes National Forest. So this first one is this is garlic mustard. This is the kitchen garden herb that was imported from Eurasia, and this is the one that I just mentioned that disrupts the life cycle of the rare West Virginia butterfly. It also, there's something about the chemical composition of this plant that it releases chemicals that inhibit the growth of other plants. And it also can do things under the soil, altering the connections that trees have with mycorrhizae and microbes. And so it's kind of a complicated one. And now this is the kind of thing that you would, you know, you could see this on the side of the road. Sometimes, you know, it could be on the edge of, you know, your garden, but it can definitely be in the middle of the woods. You can be in the middle of the woods, and I'll show you what that looks like.
You're welcome.
So this is an infestation that I surveyed. I was doing a survey for a project called FLIPS, Finger Lakes Invasive Species Strategy for the National Forest. And so this was, I mean, you can see here, this is just a complete, all there is in the understory in this forest is garlic mustard. There's nothing else growing. Another one that we've tried to manage in the forest is Japanese stilt grass. And this is an annual grass. that decreases biodiversity, not just of plants, but as animals as well. And it's dispersed in a number of ways. It can spread over land through the movement of soil and water. It can move through the water. It's spread by people, and it also reproduces vegetatively by stolons, which are like above ground stems that have nodes that root. So they individual, sort of like a strawberry. And this is the kind of thing it does, like streams, forested floodplains, stream banks, fields, trails, ditches. You can even find it in lawns and gardens. And the main thing that it does look very similar to a couple of native grasses. One, the Virginia cut grass, it looks very similar to this plant, and it does grow with this plant. But if you look at the photo on the left, you can see that there's like a silver kind of reflective stripe going down the length of the leaf blade. And that's very distinctive for this species, and it doesn't occur in the other species. I was doing a little bit of homework on it, and apparently one plant can produce between 100 and 1,000 seeds that can persist in the soil bank for at least 3 years. This is a picture of, we had a group of young people from the Vermont Youth Conservation Corps come help us. And this is in the Finger Lakes National Forest. There was a lot of it, a couple of miles of it along a stream. And we were trying to, we worked for several days, removing it, bagging it, and getting it out of the forest. Another plant that I've seen a fair amount of in the Finger Lakes is pale swallowwort. There's two swallowworts. There's a pale swallowwort, and there's a black swallowwort. The one that I've seen the most is a pale swallowwort, and this is what it looks like. This is from the Finger Lakes. This is a vine that climbs over vegetation, forms extensive patches, smothers other vegetation. It's it also, a couple other interesting things about it. It does have an aspect to it similar to the garlic mustard, in that it can disrupt the life cycle of monarch butterflies. Apparently, if they deposit their larvae on a swallowwort, either one of the species, the caterpillars would die. They won't. So it can't complete, the animal can't complete its life cycle. Now this, you can see this on the side of the road. You can see it in fields, but you can also see it in the middle of the woods. So this is one picture of it in the middle of the woods. This picture on the right here is in the middle of a field. It's just completely growing up this big shrub, overgrown shrub. It also has a deep fibrous root system. It can tolerate disturbance, drought, and it also, unfortunately, likes shallow soils over limestone, which is a kind of a special habitat where you can find a lot of rare species. And so that's another drawback. And 1 square meter of these plants can produce 1,000 to 2,000 wind dispersed seeds each year. So you can understand how it would spread. This is an example of a site that I found in the Finger Lakes National Forest. And it was just, again, like the garlic mustard, similarly, the forest is a complete understory of this vine. There's no other plants. There's no other shrubs. There's no other herbs. There's no other ferns. Another vine that is very invasive in New York, as well as New England and a bunch of other places, is Oriental bittersweet. And this is a vine that was used for wreaths and flower arrangements, and then people threw it in the woods, and And it's got these really beautiful berries. And when it starts out, when it's reproductive and small, the leaves kind of look like linear, but then as it gets bigger, they become round. So the scientific name is Celastrus orbiculatus, meaning, you know, orbicular, round. And this photo on the right shows what it can do once it becomes mature. The stems become very thick, and they can girdle trees, and they'll literally just strangle the tree. And this, you can find this in a bunch of different places, you know, on the edges, within a forest, on the edge of a forest, in a field, roadsides, and it becomes very thick and very woody. And this is a picture of, this isn't actually in the Finger Lakes, but this is a really good shot of that I've seen before in other places in southern New England, of Oriental bittersweet just completely obscuring whatever, you know, you can't really tell. You can sort of see some native trees that look like they could be beech and behind, but you can't tell what it's growing on. There's a couple of plants that are subshrubs that are very invasive, and one is the purple loosestrife. And it's very beautiful. Look how beautiful it is. As you can see why people wanted to plant it. It's an obligate wetland plant, though you can see it in a bunch of different kind of mesic situations. Like it could be sort of like on the side of the road that doesn't seem like it's wetland, but it's kind of moist. It can even grow in gardens and people's yards. It's very aggressive in sunny wetlands. And this is another prolific seed dispersal species. One plant can produce 2 to 3 million seeds each year. And here's a picture of, this is actually an art print. This person it's a beautiful picture, and you can see, you can really appreciate how invasive it is. You can buy this. I put the reference to all the credits for images that aren't mine. The other species, the other subshrub is Japanese knotweed. And this, unfortunately, this is one of the most invasive plants in the world. And I took some pictures of the rhizomes. Unfortunately, this species is, it's manageable, but it's very, very hard to completely eradicate. It reproduces by seed, but it also reproduces by these underground rhizomes, and they're horizontal stems that root at different nodes. And when you pull it up, if you don't pull up the complete rhizome, even fragments can remain viable under like 8 feet of soil. So this is a really challenging invasive species. Here's a picture of it in the Finger Lakes. Multiflora rose is, I think that's probably one of the worst invasive species that I've seen when I've been working in the Finger Lakes. And this is another species where, you know, you can see it in a lot of different places. It can be in the middle of the woods. It can be in a field. It can be on the side of the road. It can grow in different ways. It can grow as a shrub. It can grow as a vine. It can form these huge, like impenetrable thickets, like literally like where you could not walk through it unless you had a machete. And I put this little image here because sometimes there's a bunch of native roses, and it's not always easy to tell the difference when you have very small vegetative reproduction. But if you look at the stipules at the base of the where the stem and the leaf connect at the plant, the stipules are really, really fringy. So that's a really good indicator and a good way to tell when the plant's really small. And here's another picture of an infestation in the Finger Lakes. And I was mentioning to Hillary at the beginning of before I started the presentation that, you know, I feel like I took this picture like in the midst of it, but I feel like you really can't appreciate it. The picture doesn't really do it justice. It's almost like, you know, you really, if you're there in person, you can really appreciate how much there is. And it's just sort of like you're standing in it and there's just nothing else. Another very aggressive woody species in the Finger Lakes is the bush honeysuckles. And this is, I've got a picture of, this is an invasion in the forest, the berries, the flowers. This can be found in a lot of different places. It can be on like a river floodplain, it can be on the edge of a swamp and a wetland, or it can be, you know, in a field or, you know, on the side of the road. And it has a very high fruit production. A single shrub can yield thousands of berries. Each berry has 2 to 6 seeds. This plant, you know, has basically been spread and it continues to be spread by birds. But the plants can also resprout. Like if you pull it out and you leave, you know, if you leave the plant like prostrate on the ground, it can actually root. So these are a couple of images of infestations of the bush honeysuckle in the Finger Lakes National Forest. And this is just, I don't know if you can really, you know, hopefully you can appreciate it, but it's just, you're standing there and there's just nothing else under the trees but that plant. A couple more woody species that we see in the forest are Japanese barberry. This is another woody shrub, but it's smaller than the bush honeysuckle in general. It doesn't get to be as big. It's got red berries. This is also something that you can find in different situations of different moisture regimes. You know, sometimes it could be in the middle of the woods, or it can be, you know, on the edge of a river or stream. And it also disperses by the berries that have a high germination rate and are also spread by birds and other animals. And this is a picture of a national historic park that I worked at a long time ago in New Jersey, Morristown National Historic Park, where I did a project here in March when the deciduous trees hadn't leafed out yet. And I just remember driving through this park and just seeing, it just seemed like acres and acres of forest with just this solid understory of Japanese barberry. It was really dramatic. And so they've been doing some work here looking at native tree regeneration rates and how they're affected by this invasive plant, by the Japanese barberry. A couple more, just briefly. We talked about this, Hillary and I talked about this one in the beginning. This is the common buckthorn, and I see a fair amount of this in the Finger Lakes. This can be a shrub, it can be a tree. It's much easier to control when it's smaller, when they get to be very, very large, and then you have to cut them down. And these are pictures from the Finger Lakes, from some pastures that I've worked at. And then we had a group, another Vermont Youth Conservation Corps group working with us, where we were doing some experiments in some of the grasslands in the Finger Lakes. And this picture on the right is a couple of people that were helping with that project. We were removing some of it manually. You can see this is the root of, you know, just one plant, a big one. And then we also did this thing where we were cutting down some of them and putting buckthorn baggies on them to see if that would you know, if that would help, if they would not, or to what extent they would rejuvenate, you know, after that. And it wasn't as successful as we had hoped. And the last one I'm going to talk about is just this autumn olive, which I did see a fair amount of this. This is in the Finger Lakes. This is in one of the pastures. And this is kind of looks a little bit like a bush honeysuckle, only the leaves are different and they're very, very silvery on the bottom. The berries are similar, but they're more kind of orangey red and dusty. And this is a plant that was probably introduced, I know it was introduced in the Northeast, in New England, by the government because it's an actinorhizal plant, meaning that it has a fungal symbiont that attaches to its root nodules that's capable of fixing atmospheric nitrogen. And so it was used as a reclamation plant and planted on the side of the road and waste areas. And so we see a fair amount of this as well. So like I mentioned in the beginning, I'm going to give, some resources just for further information. The New York invasive species information clearinghouse has a lot of information on invasive species, plants and animals, and several of the terrestrial plants that I mentioned. They have profiles on, and there's a lot of information on plants. I tried to sort of try to pick out where you could quickly find some good information in New York. Okay, so let's talk just a little bit, a couple of examples about how you might remove invasive plants. First, if you can, there are some things that you can remove manually that you don't have to, you basically just need, protective gear, trowels, a shovel. Some herbaceous species give contact dermatitis, so we recommend that people get these nitrile gloves that are that go kind of up to your shoulder. And then it's very important to dispose of these things properly. And so you want to have big black contractor bags, and I can explain if how to make a compost pile if people are interested in that as well. Sometimes you can bring them to the dump. Some of the landfills are actually taking invasive plants, so you want to check, the area that you're living in. It's a lot of work, so it's good to have a good attitude. So in terms of garlic mustard, this is again is in Finger Lakes National Forest, and this is a relatively small patch. So imagine that this was in your backyard. And behind your house. So you could work on this. What you want to do is you want to start early because, we talked about how prolific, how many seeds this plant can produce. It blooms early, so it's right now it's flowering and it's fruiting. So you can start in May and June, and you want to pull the whole plant up. If you have so much of it and you only have so much time, it's still beneficial, even if you cut off the flowers and got rid of just the tops of the plants, because all of these flowers have these long calyx, these long fruits that have rows of seeds in them. So it's really, really important to bag everything up. And I think I mentioned here about how you might create like your own compost pile, which is essentially like a tarp on the ground, putting the plants in full sun, cooking them, putting a tarp on top of them with rocks and weighting it down and basically cooking the plants until they're no longer viable. And if you have an incinerator, you could burn them, or I would check with your landfill. You have to, with this plant and with a lot of different plants, there's still, even if you remove all of these plants, there's still a lot in the seed bank. So you need to kind of think about this in terms of a long-term kind of project, like, not just a one-time thing. This is an example of we've done a lot with removing these large bush honeysuckles. These can get to be very, very big. I didn't realize how big they can get. They can get to be 8 feet or more. And we have these honeysuckle popper tools that we used on the Finger Lakes and in Vermont. These are 26-pound tools. They're about 6.5 feet long, and they're very effective. You can, even with a plant this big, you can see this one on the right, you take the end of this tool and it goes underneath the crown of the root, and then you use the pole part of it as leverage, and it basically pops the plant out, and it's very, very effective. They're not really that thick root. They're kind of shallow rooted plants. So if they're small, you can sometimes pull them out yourself, but when they get big like this, you need something like a popper. So just a little bit about treatment and management in addition to removing non-native invasive plants. This is an example I want to share with you of a river floodplain habitat restoration that we did on the Battenkill River in Manchester, Vermont. And this is an example of combining manual removal with chemical herbicide treatment. So we went in here, and you can see this is what it looked like before. We went in here and removed mostly it was invasive, huge invasive honeysuckles, and we removed them manually. And then we've been monitoring it. This is 2 years later. We also had an herbicide contractor go in and treat the stems, because we couldn't pop all of these out because they were in an area that was archaeologically important. So this is a combination of manual and chemical herbicide treatment, and it's something that you need to, if you want to really restore this habitat, you want to commit to the long term and continue to remove the plants and treat them chemically. But even a couple of years later, this is a rare plant, a great blue lobelia that grows on river floodplains, and this is coming from the seed bank. So plants are actually parts of this space that we've worked on. You can actually see native plants emerging from the seed bank. So habitat restoration. Okay, so this is the second topic. So once you've removed invasive plants from your landscape, before you decide, whether you want to replace them with native plants or ornamentals or both, you just have to do what you would basically do with doing any kind of landscaping. You need to evaluate the conditions of your landscape. So I have a couple of really good slides here of that illustrate, thinking about the bigger picture of your house and your gardens within the larger ecosystem. So, it helps, to think about, like, what is the land like surrounding your home? What's the land use history? Is it forest? Is it wetland? Has it been used agriculturally? This right here, this property on the left is a national park. This is Marsh Billings Rockefeller National Park in Vermont. This is a picture of part of the design landscape, and this is an aerial photograph of what it looks like. So this garden is actually like right here. So you can get a sense of what, what kind of habitats, surround this, the designed part of the landscape. So it's very forested. Specific things to evaluate the level of light that you have, aspects of the soil, how the moisture regime, whether it's hydric, mesic, xeric, the pH level, nutrients, the texture, the type of soil, how well it drains, the topography of your land, if it's sloped, if it's flat, if you have depressions, different habitats, forested, wetland habitats, how much space you have, and and practical things like how much time you have, and who will do the actual work if you have help, and how much space you have. So so that brings me to the third topic, which is about my favorite topic, about native plants. And we'll talk a little bit about those ecologically friendly species for pollinators and wildlife, and how you might be able to incorporate those into your landscape once you've eliminated the invasive plants. So what I would do is, once I got rid of the invasive plants, or at least reduce them just to a manageable level, you would want to figure out what kind of native species do you already have there, because chances are, you already have like some herbs. These are violets. These are native ferns, native horsetails. This is a early vascular little club moss, wintergreen. This is a wintergreen shrub, a little oxalis. This is a maple. And to identify plants, I'm just offering a couple of good references. Go Botany is a big project that took several years to essentially put the flora of New England online. It's a project that was undertaken by the Native Plant Trust through the National Science Foundation. And you can go on this website and there's different keys. There's simple keys, there's a dichotomous key, and you can actually, if you have a connection, when you're out in the woods, you can actually use it as like an online key. Also, the plants database that's managed by the USDA is a good source of like general information, especially if you have a house in another part of the country. If you want to know the range of a plant, they have maps where they show you where it's found, and the nativity status, whether it's native or not, what kind of, the wetland status of the plant, whether it's found in wetlands or not, or the percentage of where you might potentially find it in a moist to a xeric situation. And then this Newcomb's Wildflower Guide is probably, this is what it's kind of the tried and true field guide. It's a very good field guide to begin with if you just want to learn more about wildflowers. And so I offered that. And then I have some New York references too that I'll get to, but so you want to observe like where they grow naturally in your, around your house, in the landscape that you want to design, make note of the conditions under which they grow successfully. So for example, these are native plants that you would find in, an open, full sun, like dry situation. Like if you had, a meadow or pasture in front of your house, this is, milkweeds, goldenrods. This is an angelica. These are some native plants that would commonly be found in woodlands, under shade with filtered light, kind of mesic soil. These are the trilliums. This is a Canada bunchberry, and this is a blue bead lily. These are some native plants that you would also find in the woods, but the woods would be in same kind of situation, filtered light, but the soil, there's something about the soil that's different. The soil is richer. It's associated with northern hardwood forests, and you see things like this baneberry, which is also called doll's eyes, on the left, and then this maidenhair fern, and then this is a wild ginger on the right. These are some plants that you would find on the edge of wetlands, that around open water, full sun, plants that they can be saturated or inundated. This is a holly, a native holly, cardinal flower, a turtle head, and a marsh marigold. And then these are some plants that you would find in a specific kind of wetland. These are plants that you would find. This is the great blue lobelia that I showed you earlier. This is a fiddlehead ostrich fern. And this is a wild cucumber on the right. And these are plants that are associated specifically with alluvial soil, like so they're found a lot on river floodplains, soil that's porous and fine and rich in minerals. So you want to select plants, native plants that are compatible with the conditions and habitats that you have in your home landscape. Some of the references that you'll find will give you suggestions on what you should replace one particular species with. And so I just offered this as an example. It's been suggested that garlic mustard be replaced with either one of these native plants, foam flower or boneset. And in considering these two choices, this foam flower is really like a woodland kind of plant. This boneset is a plant that is associated with wetlands. It's usually something that you see, you know, on the edge of wetlands. So the best choice really depends on, you know, the landscape that you have and the conditions that you have. And I'll just go through a little bit of information about some native plants that are ecologically friendly. These are species that attract pollinators. There's a whole bunch of really beautiful ones. This is a New England aster on the left. This is a pin cherry. This is a false hellebore, and then an elderberry. And then we also have a monarda here too, which is a bee balm. And here are some examples of plants that provide food for wildlife. Pollen, nectar, seeds. This right here I just show, these are the berries on the left here of buckthorn, and they've done some work on this where they've actually found that, I had people say to me, well, you know, what are the birds going to eat if you remove all those trees? Well, it turns out that that these buckthorn berries contain a chemical laxative that prevents sugars from being digested. So it's not a great choice for wildlife. And then one of the things that people suggest, in addition to planting native species to attract animals and pollinators and other kind of wildlife, is not to do less grooming, to leave the garden litter like over the winter, not to cut everything down, because a lot of not just birds, but butterflies and other insects like to lay their eggs and overwinter and things like, this is milkweed. And so I just throw that out there. And I'm going to show some examples of some native plant gardens. This is an example outside of our office here in Vermont, the Green Mountain National Forest. This is a very small, easily maintained native plant gardens that was, it was designed specifically to attract pollinators, and it has plants that bloom in a succession. Right now we have some wild columbine and some wild geranium blooming, and then those will stop, and then the milkweeds will bloom, and then the New England aster and the goldenrods will bloom. And so this is something that if you had an open space around your house, this would be very easy to design. This is a more complicated garden, that a large native plant garden, which is actually at the New York Botanic Garden. And I thought it was interesting here. I just got this from their website. Apparently this garden has nearly 100,000 different species of native plants, trees, shrubs, ferns, grasses, herbs. So this looks like a really interesting place to visit if you're interested in native plant gardening. The other thing that people are seem to be doing a lot and thinking about lately is instead of spending a lot of time maintaining a lawn and watering a lawn, people have been creating wildflower meadows that support pollinators and then reduce the amount of time and resources that you need to maintain a lawn. Some areas don't want to be lawns. So this is an image that I chose. And in terms of native plant resources, I'm going to throw this out here. This is the Native Plant Trust is a good source of information. You can also buy plants from them. They used to be the New England Wildflower Society. They're in Framingham, Massachusetts. They recently changed their name to Native Plant Trust. And if you go on their website, they have all kinds of information. You'll see this page in the middle. You know, it has all these different parameters. Like you can decide, you know, what color flower, how high you want the plant, you know, what kind of sun situation you have, what kind of soil, where you are, and it will give you a list of native plants that might be good for your particular situation. And like I said, you can buy plants from them as well. And I thought there's a lot of good information about native plants through the New York Flora Association. And I offered this page here. They have on their website, they have a botanical links page with all sorts of links to all kinds of really good information about native plants, research, gardening, museums, herbaria. So if you're interested in native plants in New York, this would be a really good place to look for information. In addition to the New York Flora Atlas, which comes from the New York Flora Association. This would be something somewhat similar to the Go Botany site, but where you can look up different plants that are native to New York, and they have thousands of pictures on here and a lot of really good information. So that is and then of course, Cornell has been, they've really been like at the forefront of invasive species science. And so there's a lot of good information on the Cornell Cooperative Extension website, and they have different chapters. So this chapter, all these different little segments here, all these links on native plants, links on, you know, gardening to attract wildlife, pollinators, invasive species. This actually came from the Orange County site, but these things they're not necessarily specific to that particular area. But there's a lot of really good information. And like I said, you can, it's organized by county, so you can go on whatever county you happen to be in, whether it's Seneca or Schuler, and but there's other relevant information and other county sites too. I actually like to still read books and use books. And this is the latest book, The Native Plants for New England Gardens, that the Native Plant Trust has published. This is the latest one, but I really like Bill Kalina's books. This one that he did, I guess back in 2000, Growing and Propagating Wildflowers. And then he did a couple of books on specifically on ferns, mosses, grasses, and shrubs and trees. These are some national resources related to ecological landscaping that you can get a lot of good information from. Like this National Wildlife Federation, you can go on their website and you can, you know, they have interactive aspects of their site where you can enter in, you know, where you live. Like for instance, the National Audubon Society, this middle section here, you can enter in your zip code and it will tell you, you know, what kinds of birds and what kinds of plants you would plant for where you live if you want to attract those kinds of birds. And there's also this Ecological Landscape Alliance, Ecological Landscaping Alliance, which has a lot of good information. So the last thing I just want to talk about is kind of the aesthetics of blending ornamental and native plants together in your landscape. Because, you know, there's so many beautiful ornamental plants, there's so many beautiful native plants. So what if I was going to do this, I would take an inventory, make an inventory of all the garden perennials and woody landscape plants. And, you know, at the same time, note the conditions that these plants seem to be doing well. And then think about how to combine them aesthetically while at the same time matching their environmental requirements. So this is two pictures. So this on the right-hand side, this is in Vermont. This is Canada Mayflower that's growing in a carpet, a native plant, you know, on the forest floor. This is also on the left here is a separate site at a reserve in Massachusetts with, you know, daffodils as an understory in the forest. You can see how these would go together, you know, that you could mix these two plants. There's a lot of native and ornamental plants have amazing characteristics and attributes that can add interest to gardens and design landscapes. And some examples are, you know, different growth habits, vines. This is a sedge, a native sedge, a weeping willow. These beautiful different leaf shapes, colors, patterns, textures, variation. You know, you can mix hostas that like, you know, shade in a shaded kind of wood situation with, you know, something like wild ginger or maidenhair fern. There's also trees that have really attractive branching patterns. This is a juniper, you know, here's a yellow birch and a white birch. Then a stunning array of varied flower arrangements, shapes, forms. And, you know, these plants aren't invasive. Beautiful fruits of different shapes and colors, you know, some of which are edible, some of which you can make into jams. This is elderberry, viburnum, apple, maple. And this is an example of this. Sometimes you don't find them at the same time. You don't find them at the same time always, like flowering and fruiting. But these are striking native flowers and fruits together. So in the top this is Canada bunchberry when it's flowering, and then underneath this when it's fruiting. This is in the middle is it's a maple leaf viburnum, and then on the end here is a blue bead lily. And I'm just going to show a couple of examples of different gardens that show how you can blend native plants with garden perennials and woody landscape plants. This is a nice example. The homeowner had a wooded area next to their house, and they combined hostas with a couple of different native plants. There's the foam flower and the maidenhair fern, and then they groomed these trees to open up the views. I think that's a nice example if you have, if your land looks like that. This is an example of a larger landscape of shaded woodlands with filtered lights. This is actually at the Native Plant Trust. Which is also called Garden in the Woods because it is a garden in the woods. So this is an example of a hillside garden where they mixed a lot of different textures and types of plants. There's some evergreens, ornamental grasses. This is a native grass that is one of my favorites. This is switchgrass on the right. And they've done a lot of, it's interesting, you know, what they've done on a slope here in a small space. This is an example of a native, sort of a native plant cottage garden that this idea has been gaining interest recently. Sort of if you have a home with, you know, a space like this that's largely open, where you can, you know, you can design like a sort of like an English cottage garden. You can also include native, you know, annual plants and let things self-seed. And this is the last example is, and this actually, I was looking at this slide and it kind of actually reminded me of the Finger Lakes. Like I could almost like see myself being in one of the pastures, you know, overlooking the lake. But this is an example of a historic garden off the coast of Maine. This was Celia Thaxter's island garden on Appledore Island off the Isle of Shoals in Maine. And Celia Thaxter was a poet. Her father owned a hotel out on the island. And she had this really beautiful cutting garden. You can see the house. The house is burnt down now, but it's the picture on the right is her with the house. And you could see this as being, you know, a pollinator slash cutting garden. I think if you had, you know, space like that in the Finger Lakes, you could definitely create something similar. So just a couple of groups to connect with. The group that that I'm doing this talk for, the New York State Invasive Species Program, Partnerships for Regional Invasive Species Management. And I just put a little image of their website, and then you can get involved with mapping invasives if you want to go do surveys and participate in gathering scientific data and monitoring infestations. There's also a Finger Lakes Native Plant Society. And I want to thank you for your interest and attention. All of these photographs, this is from the Finger Lakes on the right here. This on the left is Vermont. They're all photographs that I took unless I credited people. And with that, I will open it up for questions, comments.
So Marybeth, there are a few questions here in the chat box. So one was had referenced some research out of Cornell talking about garlic mustard management and really lack thereof, or not doing anything with the garlic mustard, and that populations will wane themselves out over time. Do you have any thoughts on maybe that research that you've seen in your own management in terms of just leaving garlic mustard populations and that they will die out on their own?
Well, we have been noticing, we have a problem here in Vermont, in central Vermont, with wild chervil, which I had never actually seen until I came to Vermont. It's a plant that for whatever reason was introduced and is very invasive and abundant in central Vermont. It's you know, getting into the southern part of the state too, and it seems to be actually out-competing the garlic mustard. It seems to actually be moving in and reducing the garlic mustard. But we're still trying to manage garlic mustard, even though it seems like this particular species is winning. I couldn't hear everything you said, Hillary. It was kind of like cutting out in and out.
Oh, sorry.
So I'm not sure exactly. It sounded like there was a study at Cornell. Was it that they gathered some data that suggested that you should stop, to just leave it?
Right, right.
And so we haven't gotten to that point here. But I mean, you know, I suppose you could always do, I still think if it's small, like if you had something in your woods that was a small population, I would, you know, I would still try to manage it. Even if it's a, you know, a huge infestation, if you get rid of the flowers, then you're going to greatly reduce the seed bank. You could just let it go and see what happens. So I don't know.
Yeah, no, I do agree. I think site-specific management is warranted at that point. If you have acres and acres of garlic mustard, then maybe you focus on a different species. But if you have, you know, a manageable population, it seems warranted to get rid of it. Another question came in. It said something appears to be impacting the bush honeysuckle in this person's woods. Do you have any insight into what would be impacting a bush honeysuckle?
As to what would what?
What would be impacting bush honeysuckle in their yard?
You mean how you would, what you could introduce to get rid of it?
So the question actually says, something appears to be impacting the bush honeysuckle that remains in our woods. Okay. Any ideas?
How is it being impacted? Is it, you mean it's spreading or?
Pauline, I don't know if you want to open your mic and ask directly or answer that. Yeah, so Pauline, why don't you put it in the chat and we'll go on to the next question. Next question, can you recommend a non-aggressive goldenrod for a home garden with an open, sunny area?
I don't know a specific species to recommend. They do think that there are some species that are invasive and aggressive in some of the pastures in the Finger Lakes National Forest. I would try to get in touch with somebody from Cornell or somebody local in New York. I don't know, Hillary might have some ideas on that, to find out specifically what species would be best to plant, because it does seem like some of them are invasive in the grasslands.
Sure. And do you know any good places to get seeds or native species to reseed in a reclaimed piece of land?
I know there's like a wetland seed company in Amherst, Massachusetts, that's kind of well known, but I don't know specifically in New York. I would try to get in touch with some of the flora folks, some of the folks from, there's a really credible good botanists that are associated with the New York Flora Association and the Atlas that I mentioned. And so I would try to get in touch with somebody there and pick their brain.
And someone indicated Ernst Conservation Seeds is a good local or native seed company. So to follow up on the honeysuckle, they just indicated that it's dying on their own and that's okay. They were just curious as to maybe the cause of it, since they've been trying to eradicate it for a while.
Yeah, I haven't actually seen that. I've seen just acres and acres of it as an understory in the Finger Lakes National Forest. I haven't seen large areas where they've had die-off, so I'm not really sure what's going on there.
Well, great. I think that brings us to the end of the questions. As many of you have indicated in the chat, I want to thank Marybeth Hanley for the amazing presentation. It was a really great overview of all the different topics. We so appreciate your time today during New York Invasive Species Awareness Week. Note that we have programs on Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. So check out our website if you're interested in other webinars or in-person programming. We have a lot going on. So thank you so much, Marybeth, and we hope to see you in the Finger Lakes this summer.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm sorry about the light. I didn't realize I'm in my office and everybody's gone.
Oh no,
so it's like completely dark.
Oh, everyone's.
So anyhow,
Nope, you're fine. I'm not even sure, you know, like I didn't have you on